Hello everyone, welcome to Byzantium and Friends, a podcast about all things Byzantine and about adjacent, related, auxiliary, and friendly fields, as well as about the meaning of words. I am Anthony, your host. Two topics that are very difficult to cover in the podcast medium are art and literature, in part because it's not easy to show you the art in a podcast format. I can provide links, but that's not normally how people consume podcasts. And the same is true about literature. You kind of have to read it in order to be able to have a discussion about it. You know, history, by contrast, is actually constituted in the making of it, in the writing of it. There's no thing that we can go look at or read that is history, independently of, what we make of it. I'm committed to trying, though. So today we're going to be talking about literature, or about some specific texts that have some very interesting things going on in them. Now, let me just say, most of you probably know that Byzantine literature has had a very hostile reception generally in Western scholarship, down to and right through most of the 20th century, in fact. There are all kinds of negative ways in which it's been portrayed, as imitative, derivative, uninteresting, rhetorical, and so forth. I hope to talk about this problem in some later episodes, and we're not going to be focusing on that today. I do want to say that a great deal of work has been done to counter those perceptions and the way that we study and read it, at least among experts. I'm not sure that the kind of internal rehabilitation that we have been engaged in has made the leap from sort of technical scholarly discussions to wider perception, not necessarily among the general readership, the people who might read Penguin Classics or whatever, but even among scholars in other adjacent fields, that this has been going on, and what its fruits have been. It's a still rather technical, esoteric discussion. And there are certain areas where even scholarship on Byzantine literature has not gone very far, or hasn't gone at all. I'm going to mention a couple of them here very briefly before landing on the one that will kind of preoccupy us for the rest of this discussion. So one area where I think we have a lot of work to do is in explaining why it is enjoyable to read it. So, in fact, in the past, it was very common for studies of Byzantine literature to be written by scholars who avowedly did not enjoy reading it. And a lot of the scholarship would actually take the form of, here's why I don't enjoy this. And that was scholarship on Byzantine literature. Now, we don't do that anymore, but the pendulum has not swung to the other extreme of where, we can openly talk. We can come out and talk about why we enjoy reading this, those of us who enjoy reading it. And sometimes I wonder, how many of us actually enjoy reading it? That would be something. Because if we can align our pleasures in consuming literature with those of the people who wrote and consumed it originally, we might be on a better track to understand why it looks the way it looks, why it was produced at all, what its goals were, and so forth. A second area has to do with the pretty fundamental mismatch between our perception of ethics and politics and most pre-modern ways of looking at those things, and specifically what is generally called virtue ethics, and in some cases even virtue politics. We moderns tend to look down on that as a kind of primitive and unsophisticated way of looking at things, like moralizing and so forth. It, of course, infuses Byzantine outlooks on everything, whether they're drawing from the Roman or Christian or ancient Greek traditions that infuse their outlook. They were fundamentally and explicitly premised on an understanding of the virtues and how virtues play out in whatever domain each author is writing about. There's writing to a friend, talking about a person's social behavior or a political ruler's reign. These are infused with an understanding of how virtues are supposed to shape human action. And generally, modern audiences, we are so not attuned to that way of looking at things, and we find it, as I said, sort of rather childish and try to get past it. What we need to do instead is learn about how virtue ethics works, because in some respects it's a more advanced and appropriate for human beings way of looking at the world. I'll recommend here McIntyre's After Virtue and James Hankins's Virtue Politics. The third and final point I will make is that we have generally failed to find ways to attract broader audiences of non-experts, even non-medievalists, non-historians, to read Byzantine texts. Precisely because so much of our scholarship is historical in interest, that is, we read text looking for historical facts for the most part, and because we tend to historicize them intensely. That is, each text is read against a very specific historical background. This person wrote that in order to do this in that year. The parameters of our interpretation, its horizons, remain bound to very historical moments, and it's very difficult in that way to interest people in saying, hey, look, this text does this very, very interesting thing that you can use, for example, in a class about a general historical experience that you're teaching a course on the literature of pain, for example, something we'll be talking about in this episode. How do you integrate a Byzantine text into a course like that? In order to do that, you do have to abstract the text from its very immediate historical moment. I don't mean disregard that or not try to understand it, but you have to look for ways that it speaks to the human experience above and beyond those particular moments. And if it doesn't, if 1,000 years of medieval Greek literature don't manage to do that, then we should be wondering what on earth was going on in that society that it failed to do that. It did not. It did not fail to do that at all. We have failed to find ways to make those texts speak that way. A very interesting experiment along these lines has just been performed by my guest today, Adam Goldwyn, who is a professor in the English department at North Dakota State University. He's done some very interesting work in the past on eco-criticism in Byzantine texts, but the book that we'll be talking about today is called Witness Literature in Byzantium, Narrating Slaves, Prisoners, and Refugees. And what he looks at are texts that convey the experience of sudden captivity, enslavement, humiliation, radical insecurity in the face of the arbitrary whim and power of a person to whom you've been subjected through, the accidents of history, war, and the like. One of the most interesting things that he does in this book is to use the literature of the Holocaust and of the transatlantic slave trade in order to understand how those kinds of experiences are represented. They are radical experiences. I want you all to sort of picture for a moment what it means to be stripped of all sort of social, political, legal contexts that define your identity in most of your life, and to be thrown into a situation where you have none of the protections or even understand how those systems work, and to be so vulnerable to the arbitrary whims and interests of other people. And he finds that experience has actually been captured in very vivid ways by people who experienced it, or who claim they experienced it throughout Byzantine history. And we'll be talking here mostly about Eustathius of Thessaloniki and the capture of his city by the Normans in the late 12th century, but also Kaminiatis, another person from Thessaloniki who in the early 10th century was captured when the city was taken and enslaved for a while and taken off eventually to Syria to be sold as a slave or ransomed, and he wrote accounts of his experience. Now, I know that many of my colleagues, their intellectual defenses would automatically go up. No, We can't read Byzantine literature through the lens of, any other, body of work that comes from a different historical context, and that we must read it only against its own historical moment. And, well, I mean, yes, there's validity, I think, however, to all of these approaches. And by erecting those kinds of walls, we precisely make it impossible for our corpora to make the leap from our technical field to that of a broader discussion. And I find that Adam's approach has incredible merit at least for teaching these texts in the classroom and exciting interest about what they're doing. Because think about it this way. So here we have a text where the narrator, first person, is explaining the anguish of being lined up by the captors of his city and families being separated and not knowing whether he would ever see his loved ones again, and some people being chosen, okay, execute this one. Okay, that one we put on the ship, we take him away to sell him. Women and children put over there. Okay, and he provides this really vivid description of that experience. And we read that text, and our reaction is, does he give information about where that gate was in the wall that we can, tie in with the archaeology, or what does this reveal about family structures in Byzantine society? It's like, well, yeah, but those things are also incidental. That's not what he's primarily trying to talk to us about. What is that? How do you describe that anguish? How do you capture it in literature? And it's not enough to just say, rhetoric. Byzantine writers were so accomplished rhetoricians that they could, move you to tears, but we can see through that. We're not taken in by their, rhetorical techniques. And like that's a cynical reading. It is one possible and legitimate type of reading, but it's not the only type of reading. We can actually think, wow, it's providing a very powerful account of an experience that so many other people have felt throughout history. Okay, I've gone on far too long. Many thanks to medievalist.net, as always, for reposting these episodes. Without any further delay, here is my conversation with Adam. Hello, Adam. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's dive right into it. What is witness literature? Have you discovered a new genre hidden here in the corpus of Byzantine literature?
Right. So I definitely haven't discovered a new corpus. I guess one of the things I think about witness literature is it's not so much a genre as a sort of sensibility or a way of reading. Ellie Wiesel, the famous Holocaust survivor who wrote Night, which is considered one of the first works of witness literature, has this famous quote. He says, "If the Greeks invented tragedy, the Romans the epistle, and the Renaissance the sonnet, our generation invented a new literature, that of testimony." And I'm kind of pushing back against that, saying, well, these kind of texts existed before, but the post-Holocaust kind of gave us this new reading context to hear what people who have witnessed atrocity have been sort of saying for centuries, that, until we sort of engaged with the problem of the post-Holocaust, we weren't listening or couldn't listen. So I think for me, witness literature, as I define it in the book, has sort of two essential components. It has to be written by someone with direct firsthand participatory experience as a victim of historical atrocity. And in this way, it's a bit different than what we think of as a witness, like in the modern court system, right? Where you're a passive observer of events, or even like the expert witness who might have abstract knowledge, right? This kind of witness requires that you were there. But it's also different, I think, than what we think of as autobiography or memoir or other kinds of life writing. Primo Levi, an Italian Jew who survived Auschwitz and wrote another sort of foundational work of witness literature, If This Is a Man, he says that witness literature has to be what he calls discourse on behalf of third parties. And I think this element is really important. He goes on to talk about how the true witness can't actually narrate because the true witness is dead. But the witness sort of has to narrate on their behalf. So it's sort of those two things together. the being a direct participant of the events and narrating not just about your own life, but on behalf of those who can't narrate for themselves.
Sure. And I have to say, I mean, reading your book, and in particular the chapters on the texts that I have studied the most in the past, Eustathius and Comeniates, that we'll be talking about today, you do make them more moving than I had imagined they were when I read them in the past. And I have to say that, I mean, at times I read them like as historical sources, and that tends to be a dry kind of reading. And at times I read them as this category that we're trying to come to grips with of Byzantine literature that we do through rather formalized concepts of genre, and which also tend to classify and render them dry in a way. And you're actually looking for the human experience encoded in there. And in order to sort of tease it out, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that in order to do that, you're comparing them to the experiences of powerlessness and enslavement and degradation that you find in literature about the Holocaust and the slave trade. And you're doing that in order to elicit these kinds of experiences, right, from those Byzantine texts. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we think about is, it happened so long ago, but the Holocaust, it feels so immediate. But one of the things I think that these authors come back to time and time again is that for them, this was the subjective, affective, experiential equivalent of that. And I just need to be always very clear at the outset. I'm not making any sort of comparison that the
Right.
Holocaust was as bad as or worse than, or I'm not. I like very tried to stay away from that. But just to say, the ways that we read Holocaust literature or slave narrative, African American slave narratives, can inform us about these subjective experiences. And Eustathius of Thessaloniki, who was present at the fall of that city in 1185, he says something like, this was the worst catastrophe that had ever befallen anyone. And if anyone denies that or says otherwise, I'll have words with them. So, we as modern historians could say, well, one conquest of one city that happened in 1 year, I mean, yeah, it was bad. But, compared to the Holocaust, that's a thing we can say as historians. But for Eustathius, he saw his whole world eviscerated in a moment. So he felt, that it was the end.
Yeah. So let's be clear here for the audience. Your theme is not genocide, right? It's not about numbers. No. It's not about institutions. It's not about anything like that, right? It's the way in which a very subjective experience is represented in a, let's say, first person narrative in a text. And this could be the experience that like one person had. It doesn't, yours is not an argument of scale. It's an argument of intensity and the representation of experience. And so let's just be clear so that the audience knows what we're talking about. So let's dive into the texts. So you mentioned Eustathius. So why don't you tell us more about who, when, and what's it about? And then maybe highlight some of the more striking passages in the texts that maybe inspired you to think about them along the lines of, what you found in Holocaust literature.
Right. So you actually did a really wonderful podcast with Belke Vandenberg.
Yep.
What was it? Actually, I was just listening to it, and you talk about how you're sitting 6 feet apart. So it must have been the very beginning of COVID.
Yes.
So yes, go back and listen to that one. She's the expert on this other half of Eustathius' professional life. Right. So Eustathius of Thessaloniki was lived basically through the entirety of the 12th century. I think his dates are 1115 to 1195. The 12th century has been described as the Renaissance of the 12th century. So this was a time of increased intellectual activity, increased artistic activity, and Eustathius was born right at the heart of this in Constantinople. He would go on to become sort of perhaps the most educated man of the 12th century.
Yeah, fair enough.
In all of sort of, Europe, right? Not just Constantinople, but
Yeah.
widely read, an orator, a professor, advisor to emperors, and a high-ranking churchman. He is sent to Thessaloniki, which was then the second city of the empire, to be archbishop there. And while he's there, whom he calls the Normans or the Latins, decide to sack Thessaloniki while they're there. So, I mean, it's kind of a strange situation to imagine the most educated man of his time, and here, the city's being conquered in this extremely horrific way. He wrote, Scholia on commentaries on Homer. He wrote all this sort of high works of scholarship. And the Latins are at the gates. There, he talks about sort of walking through piles of corpses, friends that he can't sort of see who's his friends anymore because their faces are all sort of disfigured by violence. So he talks about this sort of in very detailed, visceral terms, what an actual medieval conquest looks like. And then he delivers his experience as a sermon about a year later. So that's sort of who he was. And yeah, I think some of the passages that stuck out to me were these just very visceral descriptions of the horrible things he experienced. I mean, some of them are quite hard to even summon now. But yeah, descriptions of people being killed, limbs severed, this kind of things.
Yeah, and the element of it that you draw out is the sort of disorienting experience of being put at the mercy of another person, the arbitrary whim of another person in such a sudden reversal. Now, I mean, had he thought about it, Eustathius might have imagined, that other people were living like that before, and he's a very privileged, classicist and archbishop who normally is not at anybody's mercy, but suddenly he finds himself exposed to that, and so you bring it out. So what are the moments, say, from like Holocaust literature that sort of gave you the key for those kinds of readings?
Right. So one of the sort of the things that unlocked that for me was there's this passage in Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, where he says that killing and dying had been extraneous literary things to me. And he's actually walking through Auschwitz, trying to recall this passage of the Canto of Ulysses from Dante. And I think it's one thing, I think the sort of shock that Eustathius, like Primo Levi in a way, feels is, he's read about violence, he's thought about violence, he's written about violence, but that's very different than experiencing that. And I think that's where that disorientation comes from. And then, I just sort of started seeing sort of very specific thematic parallels, these issues of thirst, right? Primo Levi says that the worst of all these things was the sharp thirst. And there's a scene where he's about to drink the water, and the other prisoners say, actually, that water's toxic, don't do it. But he's so thirsty, he has no choice. The starvation and the extreme pains of physical hunger, the shaving of heads, the separation of the family separation. So, these sort of real embodied experiences that, again, sort of highly educated person would have read about, especially in Byzantium, where he was reading about, these things in the Trojan War. Yeah. But to experience those in one's own body, I think must have come as quite a shock.
Yeah, in fact, you highlight Eustathius's focus on the body and, the experience to which it was subject during those days. He was in captivity for a while and herded back and forth and here and there and stripped and, I don't know, had his beard pulled or whatever. You use the term biopolitics in your analysis to sort of foreground this. So could you tell us a little bit about what that means and how it works in the text?
Yeah, so biopolitics is a kind of contemporary word drawn from critical theory, specifically Michel Foucault, who talks about the way in which the state and state power controls the sort of means of life and death, like, right? What are the politics that govern the bios, the life of a person? And I think that Eustathius and many of these writers of what I'm calling witness literature focus so much on that because so much of what they discuss is sort of like, no one's going to believe me if I say this. If I describe these things, no one will believe me. And Ellie Wiesel talks about that at length, this fear of not being believed, because very few people have seen a newborn torn from the arms of its mother, and the mother's screaming, and the baby's just sort of tossed recklessly into the ocean because they don't care. Right? That's a horrific, and Eustathius saw this on a mass scale. Right? So how do you that's a thing that's hard to sort of grasp onto. But like, I've been hungry. I've never been like starvation hungry.
Right.
But I can kind of get a little bit of, I have a body, so I can kind of get a grasp a little bit on what that must be like. And I've been thirsty. I've never been dehydrated to the point of death like they were. But I think the body gives these writers a way to just to give some sort of sense of what would be experienced, and then leave it to our sort of empathetic imagination to say like, okay, now multiply this by, multiply my sort of like late afternoon stomach grumbling with like multiple days of eating maggot infested bread. I think I can kind of like maybe make that imaginative leap in a way that I can't for some of the other kind of atrocities. So, who controls the body and how that body is controlled sort of marks where we are in relation to the state, our relation to power. And again, if you think of a guy like Eustathius, this was a man who lived a very elite, very pampered lifestyle. So here we find him at this moment where like, actually the state will no longer protect you. Not only will the state no longer protect you, but now there's a new state that actually has no care for your body whatsoever. And I think there's an existential agony, an existential agony that comes from that. I was protected and now I'm not. It's not just an issue of the body, but an existential agony that comes from the treatment of the body.
That's a good way to put it. And I got the sense as I was reading your chapter on Eustathius that you were trying to do a couple of things, and that Eustathius, in fact, is trying to do a couple of things. The first is to be believed, like to cross the gap, right? To bridge the gap between the things that people abstractly know, and to get them to try to understand what it's like to feel or experience that thing, right? And like, we're all in this kind of position where, like, fortunately, all this horrible stuff we experience like on our screens, right? We see photos of wars and death and all of that. And sometimes perhaps we can't even handle those. Like, I have trouble stomaching sometimes, and news media have to like be very careful about what kinds of images they can actually show to the audience, because you don't want to turn them away. And so we have this abstract knowledge of these kinds of things, but the experience of them, we're very, very far removed from it, fortunately, right?
Yeah.
But in our thinking about the narrative of our lives and the lives of others, there's so much that we take for granted that you just mentioned there at the end, about like our autonomy and who makes decisions about like what we do and what we do. The closest I've come to experiencing what it feels like for that to be taken away was when I was in the army. And I mean, like, really, it was just a series of inconveniences, nothing more. But there were other people who were deciding when I could sleep, when I could eat, when I could go to the bathroom, when I could, what I would eat, and all of that. And it cuts pretty close. Like, at some point you're like, wait a minute, like something has been stripped away here that I had always taken for granted. And imagine that at the hands of a hostile. Well, anyway, so you talk about and Eustathius tries to reconstruct this space that you enter when all these conventions of law and the protections of the state and your social status and all of that, when those are stripped away, what's left?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I think one of the things that is left is the ability to write and to tell one's own story. And I think that disciplines that have focused a lot on the politics of oppression, right? Eustathius was and John Cominiatis. They were, the process of being captured was your clothes are stripped from you, your head was shaved, your beard was shaved, which for Byzantines was a
Mm.
all medieval Europeans. There's a sort of note, I think in El Cid, where someone pulled his beard, and this was a sort of outrage he couldn't endure. Right.
Yes.
So, the beard, the clothes, the starvation, the hunger, the family separation, all these pressures to dehumanize you, to strip you of your identity. But the capacity to tell one's own story, right, is a form of internal resistance to these external pressures, right? These external pressures saying you're no one, you have no past, you have no future, you're nothing, you're no one, you're indistinguishable from everyone else. But as long as you can, it's not just a matter of controlling the outside of the body, right? It's a matter of trying to actually kind of seize the thought mechanisms that allow you to sort of identify who you are. And I think narrating one's story or talking about traumatic experience is a way of saying you can, all this external stuff I can't control, but as long as I maintain that interiority of who I am, there's a form of resistance to that.
Yeah, because our personhood is construed in terms of all of these, but you might call it externalities, and you mean your social status and the material aspects of your life and all that. And if that's all stripped away, what are you? Just a body that's moved around, at someone else's whim. Actually, now that you were saying that, I'm remembering stories where let's say difficult encounters between men in positions of power and these extreme ascetics, where these kinds of threats just didn't work very well.
Right.
All right, what are you gonna do?
Yeah,
anyway, I mean... yeah, I remember that. So now we mentioned that. To what degree was Eustathius's representation of his experience or his own experience really coded for social class or his gender or level of education, even degrees to which he may not have been aware that he was coding for those things, but occasionally you catch him out like this is a function of who he was in contrast to what he became under Norman occupation.
Right. I mean, I think that, getting back to the sort of specifics of his biography, right, him being the most educated man of the 12th century, and I mean, elite of the elite.
Yeah.
So, and especially when we think of it in a medieval context, with modern witness literature, if we think again about the Holocaust, sort of there was an almost universal literacy among people in the camps. In a medieval context, there was very few people who could write. So in that sense, just simply having the capacity to write one's experience marked one as elite, right? We don't have the experience of the, like Levy says, I'm not the true witness. The true witness can't speak on their own behalf. So as being someone of the educated elite, that definitely shapes the kind of class-based consciousness that he has. And also, I think from the perspective of gender, certainly, and this is where some of the problems of rhetoric come in. Eustathius is he's a very rhetorical writer in general. He's a very elegant and sophisticated writer. But sometimes when he's writing about his own experience, the kind of rhetorical elements, by which I mean the sort of artificial elements, fall away. But when he writes about women, it's very much in a sort of conventional, I don't want to say rhetorical, conventional way. Virgins were raped. Young brides lamented being separated from their new husbands. Young mothers cried as they were being torn away from their babies. I mean, all of this is sort of historically verifiably true.
But stock.
Absolutely.
Right.
So that sort of authentic, like, what was a woman's experience of this?
Yes.
We can't know. We can only know what is filtered through what Eustathius says about it. And unfortunately, there's no sort of female Eustathius.
Right. Yeah, because I can imagine that, women would have had very different kind of experience of that event. But I don't think he had much access to it.
Yeah, especially, being a churchman.
Yes. But, now not about gender, but I just remembered that Eustathius freed his slaves in his will. We have his will. And he says he actually has an anti-slavery argument that might even have some vague Stoic roots. I actually remember Charles Brand was working on this before he died, but I don't think he ever published anything. that I don't know. Maybe Eustathius had a kind of awakening about that. But so you mentioned, rhetoric in that sense. Actually, I want to get your reaction to the way in which this text has been traditionally used by scholars, and I mentioned a couple ways, in the beginning. And what have you gotten any pushback in any kind of initial presentations of your readings from Byzantinists? Because I mean, to be clear, the text is usually read as historiography, even though, yeah, it's in the form of a sermon, but it's a narrative of an event that happened. And so historians rely on it a lot. Like I can tell you that we do, right? In the late 12th century, it's a key source. And so there's a premium placed on its historicity and Eustathius as a reporter. And so how does your reading interface with that kind of use of the text or disrupt it?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, I think most of the pushback I've gotten has been from the kind of position that we as scholars, that Eustathius was sort of like us, an empiricist scholar. And I think that you're absolutely right to call it sort of like, mining the past for facts.
Data mining, yeah.
Data mining. And I mean, certainly it has facts in it. Sure. Right. Yeah. And one of the things that Eustathius focuses on is, his concern with absolute truthfulness, because the events themselves are already so outlandish or so, incredible in the sense of difficult to believe that, he has to have an absolutely rigid adherence to truth in doing that. But he was also, he was there and that affected him. So I think, if he had wanted to just write a piece of historical narrative, he could have, but he didn't. He included so much about his own interiority, how he felt, how he experienced these things. So I think it's almost, if we're going to use him for our purposes, then we need to make sure that we're also listening to him. If we're using him if we're reading him for what we want, we owe it to him to read it on his terms as well. What did he want us to get from that? And I think, the events that he describes are awful. And we talked sort of a little bit earlier about, how we ourselves don't have that much, thankfully don't have maybe personal direct experience of these kinds of events. And one of the things that some of these scholars and writers of witness literature is they just say, like, don't look away, right? Just keep looking. And I think that it's hard, and it's almost easier to say, well, like, let's look at Eustathius and say, well, what was the spacing of defensive formations within Thessaloniki in the second wave of the attack?
Yes.
Right. Like, it's a kind of looking away.
Yeah.
Almost. And I think it does remind us of our own precarity, right? Eustathius, I think scholars in particular identify with Eustathius. He's a lot like us. So if this could happen to him, like, how safe are we really? I mean, this was the ivory tower of the ivory tower this guy was living in.
Yeah.
And this happened to him. So I think there's an element of our own precarity. And it's easier just to sort of like not look at that. The sort of one of the original scholars of witness literature of the Holocaust was Dory Lobb, and there's a scene that is described in the book where an Auschwitz survivor says I remember these 3 smokestacks, and the scholars were saying, well, actually there's only 2, so this witness doesn't know this witness doesn't know what they're talking about. But in fact, they're offering a different kind of subjective truth that might not match with facts, but we can't say that. But what does it mean that this person experienced the past in this way, right? I mean, just because it's not empirically verifiable doesn't mean it's not true. So I think that, that complicates things for sort of positivist empiricist historiography, where things that we can't prove are true to him, right?
Yeah,
and
and
that
I
shapes
have
his response.
sure. I mean, from the standpoint of someone who went through a long classics phase, I have classics in my background. I can say that historical narratives, like it's much more common in classics to read historical narratives that way, Herodotus, Thucydides, even, and so forth. That is as very, very constructed representations that, for the sake of argument, like for heuristic reasons, you start by reading it as if it were a work of fiction. Like it's a total representation, right? And so you try to understand the axes along which it's composed and its basic concepts and so on, while knowing that yes, it does have some kind of epistemic relation to external reality and so on. But like in the 90s, that didn't matter so much, right? So
Right.
you could read the text that way and try to understand them as compositions before, if ever, you got into the nitty gritty of the historical data mining. But in Byzantine studies, that hasn't happened much or at all, especially with texts that we lean on so heavily for our facts. And so I think that the problem goes a little bit deeper. It's not that we look away, even. Like, I read about the Holocaust, not what you call Holocaust literature, but like historical studies, because
Right.
I'm now like more into of a historian, right? Like more of a historian, and I know the kinds of things where my mind wants to look away. Like I know where we're getting to a point where I want to look away. That never happens with Byzantine texts, right? I mean, unless you're
Right.
getting into some long discussion of the Trinity and the energies and so forth. Okay, but that's for different reasons. And the reason it never happens, that is, I'm never like, oh, now I'm going to have to look away, is because I think I've been trained to read it as rhetoric. That is what we were talking about earlier, kind of stock things. And this concept of rhetoric, that is that the text has been pre-formatted according to a formula that Eustathius learned in the schools, right? And in textbooks, I think that predisposes us to overlook any either the more idiosyncratic or the more powerful moments, and see and our reaction would be like, wow, what a spectacular rhetorical display,
Right.
rather than, wow, what a wrenching experience. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's actually funny that you mentioned classics, because part of the like sort of deep roots of this project was I was a graduate student. We were reading Thucydides, and there's a passage where Nicias is in Sicily, and he sends a letter back to the Athenians, and he says, back in Athens, saying like, "Help me out with, I need more ships and men." And he sort of says like, "I'm suffering from like a debilitating, extremely painful kidney disease right now,
Yeah.
but like we're losing." And and I remember reading this text in class, and sort of like doing this is a dative that corresponds with, like very
Yeah.
syntactical sort of. And I'm like, but this guy is like dying of like a crippling kidney ailment. And, before the invention of anesthesia, like
Yes.
ancient and medieval people suffered a lot of physical pain that we can't really imagine either.
Yeah.
And so I just sort of like walked out of the class in a daze thinking like, how come we're sort of not treating the sort of like human element of what's happening? This is texts, this is literature that's coming to us through pain. And I think, yes, you're absolutely right. In Byzantium, we often think of rhetoric as being synonymous with artifice or with inauthenticity, or as a way of artfully dodging something. But one of the things that comes up again in the prologue to Eustathius, I mean, being such an elevated and highly educated rhetor, he's very well aware that he's using these rhetorical figures. And in the prologue, he's always saying things like, how can I write this? There's no good word for what I'm describing here. I'm going to try and describe these events, but I have to. What style should I use? If I use this elevated style, they won't. It's too
Right.
floral. And if I use this basic style, it's. So I think if we think of rhetoric as the way through which we've pre-established emotional networks can be conveyed, it doesn't take away from their truth. It's how you convey truth and emotion is through sort of conventional phrasing.
That's right. But see, that exact same thing is what they say at the beginning of like every imperial oration.
Right.
And so we're predisposed to think, well, this is sort of either insincere or formulaic. Because none
Yeah.
of us believe that, Isaac II Angelos is just so great that, words can't describe and so forth. And there I think he fell into his own trap. Like he predisposed. Anyway,
You're right, and I think that part of it requires I don't even know how to describe it, a willful part on the reader to take them at face value, which is something we're not trained to do. Like,
yes.
We're trained, especially historians, right? We're trained to say, well, Eustathius, he describes in this way, but we actually know from the archaeology that slightly something different, right? We're sort of trained to
right.
sort of like see through the sleight of hand, to sort of penetrate through the surface level to find out what they're actually saying. But I think there's some part of what witness literature requires as a reader, as a mode of reading, right, is for us to sort of willfully take them at face value. And I think that's really hard.
Yes. No,
it almost makes us feel like naive fools.
I know exactly what you mean. And I think it's to your credit that you both take the texts at face value while also analyzing them in a very theoretical way. And that's difficult to do because you're trying to access the truth that is being conveyed in the face value rhetoricity of it. And that's difficult to juggle all of those things. Let's move on. Let's turn to Cominiates and tell us, who, when, and about what. And I'm guessing it matters or not that some people believe that the text is a 14th century forgery.
Right. So yeah, okay, let's put the 14th century forgery part, let's put a pin in it, and let's talk about who he is first. So in 904, so about 300 years before Eustathius, who was again 1185, when Thessaloniki was sacked prior, in 904, by actually a Greek-born convert to Islam who came back as a kind of pirate named Leo of Tripoli. He sacked the city, and took, Cominiates says, I think 20,000 slaves. Cominiates was educated. He was a sort of mid-level church bureaucrat, but not nearly at the level of Eustathius of Thessaloniki. Sure. Sort of a mid-level bureaucrat. And he's captured. All the captives are corralled into the harbor of Thessaloniki, which is one of the most harrowing scenes, I think, in all of literature. And again, these descriptions of families being torn apart, people being killed. Cominiates is captured sort of on a tower, and he's sort of led down through the long streets of Thessaloniki. And for anyone who's been to Thessaloniki, you can imagine actually the walk, right, from the top of the upper castle down this long hill to the harbor. And he's seeing, disfigured bodies, and he's seeing, scenes of rape. He's seeing burning buildings. He describes sort of, horrific stuff. And he himself is constantly in fear for his life. There's one Ethiopian he describes who's like always trying to stab him as he's sort of, walking under guard. Yeah. Because the guards he says, we have money buried. So they want the money, but this Ethiopian just really wants to kill him, doesn't care about the money. So as he's walking, he's constantly trying to stab Cominiates as he's walking down. And then Cominiates gets put on a slave ship. He describes how he's in chains on the slave ship. He talks about this lice infestation, but they can't scratch their heads because they're in manacles. They're deposited at a slave ship, at a slave camp in Tripoli. And there he meets a man named Gregory of Cappadocia, who was another prisoner from a different raid. And Gregory gets taken to Antioch. And what we have is a letter from John Cominiates to Gregory of Cappadocia in response to a letter that we don't have that Gregory wrote to John. So John Cominiates' letter says, I'm writing in response to your letter. You asked, how we came to this and what our fate will be from here and how we arrived in this current situation. And that's the sort of backdrop for Cominiates' description of his life. So many people think that this is a forgery, a 14th century forgery. and many of these arguments are again sort of like empiricist
Yeah,
historicism.
yeah, yeah.
How what are the mechanics of letter writing and letter sending in slave camps in the early 10th century? Um, I think that there's a fairly simple answer, which was they wanted the ransom. So it was in their interest to make sure that ransom letters got sent out. So one of the things that I kind of think that Comeniatis used this the genre of the oppressor, right? Like write a ransom note, but he used it in a way that reinforced his own sort of sense of identity and who he was by writing something really both harrowing and profound. So that's a
Yeah.
little bit of the background of, and also I guess there's a second point, which is, and this is, I don't know, maybe more controversial or falsifiable, but I'm also not sure it matters because if one is actually having this experience, or if one is writing to emulate the voice of someone who had that experience, the end result could be so similar that we still get access to what a Byzantine must have felt like as a slave, or what a Byzantine must have felt like it would have felt like to be a slave. So either way, we're getting some insight into the interiority of Byzantine slavery.
Yeah, and enslavement of sort of free Roman citizens in Byzantium. And this is a topic that I've covered in previous podcasts with Noah Lenski on slavery and with Alexander Sarandis on raids. And either time you place the text, whether in the early 10th century or in the 15th, I think, those were both periods when very large numbers of sort of even urban free citizens were being taken captive and enslaved, whether by the Arab raiders or the Turks or Venetians or whatever, and in very large numbers. Like this was a social experience, right? A lot of people experience this sort of thing. And by the way, I'm personally not convinced of the arguments for a later date, and they tend to be very technical, like, well, it mentions this office, which is not attested until the next century. And it's like, well, unless it's attested here. I mean, anyway, whatever. So to what category of modern literature do you compare Comeniati's account? What are the common features?
Right. So the text that I spend the most time comparing Comeniatis to is the interesting narrative of the life of Alauda Equiano, which was one of the most influential African-American slave narratives published in 1789. And one thing that really grabbed me about that comparison is what we've just been talking about, this idea that this never really happened, these people didn't exist. And this was actually sort of really central to the reception of Equiano's own autobiography when it appeared. There was a whole variety of sort of like book reviews and newspapers, saying all this is false, it never happened. And one of the things that sort of African American studies has pointed out is the sort of book history, not just the narrative itself, but many African American slave narratives had images of the enslaved person on the book. And Frederick Douglass was famously the most photographed man of the 19th century, to say like, well, you might not trust this literary documentation, but hey, here's an image, right? And in the case of Equiano, they often had sort of white validators, right? So there would be long signatories of prominent white people at the beginning of these books. So, for instance, the Equiano's interesting narrative was the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of York had signed sort of the frontispiece as sponsors of this book. So I think there's an interesting sort of parallel in the way that, many of these writers were thinking to themselves, like, no one's going to believe me. And here we have modern scholars saying, well, it's probably a later forgery. So again, like my willful, I had to I made myself willfully naive to say like, it might be a forgery, but let's just like do a thought experiment. If it is real, what can we, what does it show us if it is real? Like, let's think. I don't need to dismiss the issue of whether it's not real. If it's not real, then that's a thing for historians to debate. But like, what happens if we think it is real? And I think, again, when we think about what makes Equiano's narrative so powerful is it's one of the few that actually describe the middle passage. So most slave narratives were written by enslaved people born in the Americas, but Equiano was actually born well, there's actually a modern debate that says he was actually born in North Carolina, and the Middle Passage part was the falsification. But for our purposes, he was born in what's modern day Benin and was kidnapped as a child, transported along with, he's carried with his sister to the coast, and they're separated. He's transported across the Middle Passage. And so, seeing that, it's one of the only places in literature where we get to actually see the inside of a slave ship. And so something like that's very similar with Caminati. We know these slaves were being transported by ship vast distances. But there's no other medieval Greek source that can show us the inside of a slave ship, or that can show us the affective, subjective experience of what it was like to be transported. And I think that's among the most, that's just it's a powerful passage. And coming back to sort of our earlier discussion of like, no one would read Ellie Wiesel's Night and say like, well, and this is how long the electrified wires were on the edge of Auschwitz. It's like, you can find that in there, but if you're sort of measuring concentration camp architecture, it's like you're kind of missing some really central element to what's happening in that text.
You're missing the point.
And so I think the same with Caminati's.
So why do you focus in your reading of Caminati's on the theme of selection? So what does that mean, and how does it appear in his text?
Right. So, I was sort of trying to push back against, as we've been discussing, this sort of empiricist, what are the facts that we can get from this text? So I really sort of wanted to sort of focus in on the most, to say like, actually, there's really horrific, painful stuff that's going on in this text. And selection was the selection with a K, and I spell it with a K in the book, is the sorting process that was used in Nazi concentration camps. So when you arrived at the camp, you would be sorted by gender, you would be shaved, you'd be given, new clothes, then you'd be sort of lined up. And the concentration camp guards would say, you live, you die, you live, you die. You go to this, you go work in this area, you go work in that area. And that was selection. And the inmates talk about, even during their incarceration, they would wake up in the mornings, and there'd be some mornings they would have selection, and they would say, you off to the crematoria, the rest of you back to work. And in the African slave context, there was a similar location. It was called the Barracoon, which was sort of the holding prison on the African coast, where they would decide who gets shipped off and where, who gets sent back. And this sort of this moment is the moment where Foucault calls it the moment of sovereign decision, right? Where you sort of fully come to realize someone else has complete power over your life and death. And that moment kind of causes a kind of rupture, right? I mean, again, like something that we, thankfully can't have an experience of, but to imagine the trauma of that moment, So for me, that moment of sovereign decision just sort of crystallizes the stakes of what I was trying to sort of highlight in these texts. That these are texts in which people are suffering the extremes of emotion, watching the entirety of their previous world sort of collapse in an instant, and sort of grappling with the question of like, well, what does that mean now?
Yeah. So I remember Leonora Neville in her book on gender in Byzantium, actually the first episode that we recorded for this podcast. She talks a lot about Caminati's and his concern, among other things, in his narrative to maintain his gender dignity in a way, right? Like to, in various ways, show that he's kind of a little bit sort of aloof, or sort of capable of stoically withstanding all of this and all that. So do you see that also in the narrative? And what other things is he trying to accomplish? Well, what's he trying to tell his reader about himself going through these experiences?
Right. So one of the things that I think is really fascinating about these texts, again, is this sort of aspect of interiority. Reading them is reading the thought process of someone going, sort of processing before our eyes a world-altering trauma. So I think we see that in Caminati's. Caminati's sort of has these passages where it is very objective. He says, and then fathers were separated from children, and there was a particular father whose children were sold into slavery, and you're like, wait, those were your children, right? And like the shock of that realization for the reader, right? He's not talking in an abstract way; he's talking in about himself. And I think there's a way of reading that psychoanalytically, of sort of like, how is he trying to tell a story that's horrifically traumatic, and there's an element of dissociation there. And I think also that there's an element of, we as, if we think about the sort of the contemporary novel, you imagine someone's just sort of sitting and writing in a, you're Jonathan Franzen sitting at a coffee shop, sort of like imagining what happens to their character next. But the location of the writing of a letter from a prison camp, I think, belies the idea that there's a consistent voice. So I think one of the things that I find intriguing about Comeniatis is the way he's sort of describing things objectively, and then he'll say, "Oh, sorry, I've been talking about this too long." He's describing Thessaloniki, right? What it used to be like. And he says, "Oh, I've been narrating too long. Pain for the loss of my homeland has made me lose the thread of my narrative. Okay, let me get back to this other thing that's happening now." And he kind of he has these sort of authorial interruptions. So there's like a sort of what we would recognize as a historiographical voice, right? Something that we would find in Skilitsis or the first parts of Choniatis or something like this. But then there's these jarring intrusions, like by this guy suffering emotional pain, and we're like, okay, dude, like go back into your. I don't know what to do with this part. I'm just gonna like get back to the historical thread. But he brings up these, his emotions keep the mask of the historiographer keeps cracking, and we see this person suffering. And we see something quite similar in Nikitas Choniatis. He says, and now I'm writing from this, and I'm so mad at everyone, and I'm in this refugee camp far from Constantinople, and he actually goes back and revises portions of his text. So the idea that these texts were created in an objective way, kind of belies the empiricist positivist notion that in fact these were texts written in the moment, from the perspective of a person who, had Nikitas Choniatis not been at the conquest of Constantinople, not been driven away as a refugee, not been turned away by his former wealthy patrons, his history would have looked very different.
Yes.
And so, what's the fact?
Yes. So you mentioned Choniatis, and we're almost out of time here. Briefly tell us some of the other texts that you talk about in the book, just so people can know in case they are interested more in those texts than the two that we've discussed. So you mentioned Choniatis, so his flight and exile from Constantinople. What else?
Right. And then I think those are the three main sort of like what we would categorize as non-fictional texts. Yeah. But then there's a genre, a 12th century genre it's called the Komnenian novel, right? Works of fiction produced under the patronage of Komneni. And these are works of fiction. And I actually write about them in the context of Holocaust fiction, novels about the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And also in terms of African-American literature, I talk about Roots, Alex Haley's Roots, and he described it as faction, right? A sort of mix of fact and fiction to get to, an actual truthfulness. So while these authors were in Constantinople and they themselves never experienced the things that they're describing, the fictional characters in their novels are often enslaved, they're freed, so they can give a sort of more rounded portrait of, and we actually get actual women slaves in those texts. Mm-hmm. Again, it's fictional women narrated by men. So it's not an actual, woman slave narrative, but given the Byzantine archive we have, it's about as close as we can get.
Right. So these are the kind of familiar story of, boy meets girl, girls abducted by pirates.
Yeah, that'll chestnut.
All right. So thank you, Adam. I have to say this was one of the most interesting and sort of engaging readings of Byzantine texts that I've come across in a long time.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't know how you managed to do this, but it's not something that I think the field in its usual kind of operations would have produced. And clearly, you were inspired by reading literature very broadly from all over the world in order to do it. which is something that we should be doing, I think, rather than keeping things with, in a sort of tight, narrow, contained box. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. Bye and take care.